Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm glad you could be with us. And for those who are watching this on tape, we're glad that you can do this. This looks like it's going to be a really good um, topic for us today. I'd like to introduce Nicole Harrell. She's with Kaufman and Canoles. And Nicole is a member of the firm's Norfolk office and chair of the Data Privacy and Security Practice Group. Nicole regularly assists clients with cyber preparedness and breach response. Her data privacy and security practice includes preparation of incident response plans and counseling clients on preparing for a cyber incident. Nicole helps clients understand their risks and plan accordingly. Once a cyber incident occurs, Nicole coordinates forensic analysis, media announcements, response plans, and notifications. In addition, she works with clients on cyber insurance coverage and claims. Nicole regularly reviews and negotiates third-party vendor contracts for the data security and privacy concerns. Nicole's intellectual property practice includes federal and state trademark registration, copyright registration, and assignment negotiation of software development and licensing agreements, and licensing of intellectual property. Her commercial practice includes entity formation, corporate law, mergers and acquisitions, and general contract negotiation. She also has experience in negotiating supply and distribution agreements. She regularly assists clients with alcohol beverage licensing and regulatory matters in Virginia, including representation before the Virginia Alcohol Beverage Control Board. Nicole also represents franchisors in regulatory matters, including preparation of franchise disclosure documents, franchise agreements, and related auxiliary documents, registration, and compliance. In addition, she represents franchisees in the review of franchise disclosure documents, negotiation of franchise agreements, and termination of franchise agreements and relationships. Thank you, Nicole, for being with us today. And also today before we start with you, Sarah Piska, who is the chairman of this committee on the board of Retail Alliance, is here. And so I want to give a shout out to Sarah for being here with us this morning. So Nicole, we thank you and look forward to listening to everything about data privacy and security for small businesses.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone for joining. I guess as Beth mentioned, if you have a question, please put it in the chat box and I will try to monitor that as we go along. So don't hesitate at any time during the presentation. So we will jump right in. And what I generally like to do at the outset is to give kind of a general overview of the types of threats that we typically see and things that are very common. As you can imagine, the threats are constantly changing. If, for example, you were to look at ransomware from several years ago to ransomware now, the ransomware sort of itself has evolved, as well as the actions that are taken by the threat actors as well. Initially, if you paid the Bitcoin, your information was usually returned to you. That is not necessarily the case anymore. If you were to elect to pay the fee that they're asking on ransomware, your data may or may not be returned, and it may or may not be in a condition where you can actually access and use it going forward. So it has evolved. If you think of the way each of you works to evolve your business over time, the individuals sort of who are the perpetrators here are also doing the same with respect to their business, albeit fact that it is extraordinarily damaging in nature. You have both private actors, you still have state actors at the sort of small business level. If you outside maybe of the government contracts realm, you will not necessarily see a lot of state actors. It's more going to be private actors who are out for financial gain, whether that being obtaining and accessing PCI or credit card data, or obtaining personal data of individuals. So as I've mentioned, ransomware, again, that's one that is extraordinarily common. W-2 scams are still also very common. We may have at this point in time seen the first wave of that, at least for 2021, particularly since taxes are due here very shortly. They would obviously have already been due, but there has been an extension for that. BEC, which means business email compromise, that is probably one of the most prevalent for small businesses that we actually see. So an example of a BEC or CEO fraud, as I have here, is an individual will spoof the email address of someone at sort of a high level of authority within an organization. Using that spoofed email address will then send an email to, let's say, the controller to say, please wire X amount of dollars to this account. We've had a change from a vendor. This is the information they provided to us. If you were to go wire that money, it would not be going to the vendor as the individual in the email had stated, rather it would be going to an account that may be in the US that will quickly then be transferred offshore to an account. So that type of business email compromise can be extraordinarily damaging. You can work with financial institutions if you were the victim of that. However, oftentimes the way the financial institution agreements are written, if you ask your bank to wire the funds, your bank is not generally going to be liable. Now, they do have obviously resources and to act upon and work in connection with the FBI. And if you act quickly enough, some of those funds may be able to be recovered. However, a significant amount of those funds may not be recovered. And that is a loss that is not typically going to be covered by your bank or often by sort of any insurance that you may have. So really quickly, there's a question here giving an example of a private actor versus a state actor. So a state actor is going to be a government actor, such as you'll often see sort of the Chinese government or the North Korean government attempting to obtain information. A lot of times that the targets there are going to be something in the government contracting realm or directly sort of with utilities is a big one. They still actually do look for personal and private information, but their focus is a little bit different in terms of the high level of information that they're after. And a private actor would just be someone who's not generally acting on behalf of a government in an effort to hack into a system and obtain information. So there are a couple other types here that may not be as prevalent with respect to your particular businesses. Obviously, real estate transaction fraud is probably not going to be one of those. We do still see quite a bit of that. Phishing is something that you're all probably very familiar with, and that is often the initial way that someone gets into your system. And we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly in ways to potentially combat phishing. So this is a graphic from an institution that does a breach survey every year. This is the most recent one that they have done. And it gives you an idea of what the source of a cyber attack may be. Obviously, the largest piece of that is some sort of malicious attack. A system glitch could be an issue where something is not coded correctly and causes a problem. Human error is still a huge factor here, and it's one that we'll talk quite a bit about today. I have the next couple of slides are going to give you some information on sort of the state of breaches, so to speak, and the statistics, particularly with respect to small businesses. And the slides that are going to follow here, the information from them is a couple of years old from a particular survey that was related to small businesses, but it's still relevant here, I think, as we have this discussion today. You can see that the cost of data breaches is astronomical. It is extraordinarily expensive factor in our economy and to each of your businesses. When we have sort of the average total cost of a data breach here, $8.64 million, obviously that takes into account some of the mega breaches that you have seen over the years. Probably the most infamous one that etched in people's mind is the Target breach, as that was one of the first ones that people really paid attention to, but there have been numerous breaches after that of equal or even greater size, including the Equifax data breach, the Yahoo data breach, and multiple others. Specific to the retail industry, the average cost of a data breach is just over $2 million. Now, again, that takes into account that you have sort of very large players in the retail market. If you're looking at it to sort of further break it down, about $150 per lost or stolen record. So obviously you can see if you have a significant number of data records per sort of individual that you're holding within your system, the cost can escalate very quickly. I think the issue here that is most surprising is the average time it takes to identify and contain a data breach is 280 days. Most of the time, the perpetrator is in the system for a very long period of time, going unnoticed and waiting for a particular event to occur before they launch their attack, so to speak. And then from that period of time, there's some point for you to actually identify it, and then for you to be able to contain it and start to mitigate and respond to the breach accordingly. So as you can see here, 61% of attacks and breaches target small to medium-sized businesses, with 48% of those as a result of phishing and social engineering. Small businesses in particular, and medium-sized businesses in particular, are very vulnerable here because when you're looking at your budget on an annual basis, your budget is already set in certain buckets, and you will sort of spend accordingly. What a lot of small businesses and medium-sized businesses don't do is budget for security type issues. And I think it's important for businesses to actually consider that on a regular basis, because once you have a data breach, we'll go out on a limb here and say you wish you had thought about some of those things early on and considered them earlier in the process, because not only sort of are breaches expensive, but they're extraordinarily disruptive for your business. So 51% of businesses experience ransomware attack. Again, ransomware is very prominent and still continues to be one of the most prevalent means of cyber attacks that we see. 21% of small and medium businesses rate their ability to mitigate risks as highly effective. So that means there are over 80% of businesses who do not feel that they would be able to effectively mitigate any sort of breach. The number of records, again, these statistics are from 2017, 2016, but as you can see between those 2 years, the number of records increased pretty dramatically, and that has actually only continued to increase over time. 60% of small businesses go out of business within 6 months after a cyber attack. That is a very unfortunate statistic, and I can say that we have certainly seen that over the course of time. So question, is there a certain amount or percentage of a budget that be allocated to potential cyber security attack? That's a great question. It's hard to pinpoint a number there. I think one of the things that you have to consider that can go a long way in mitigating is whether or not you obtain cyber insurance. And we'll talk a little bit about cyber insurance at the closer to the end of the presentation. The $1 million question with respect to cyber insurance often is, how much cyber insurance should I get? What's the right number? And that's obviously very hard to sort of just pull out of the air. I think you really have to look at your business and have a insurance broker who's knowledgeable when it comes to cyber insurance, and to help you figure out what the right number is. So some additional information here. Small and medium-sized businesses have become more targeted, or the attacks have become more targeted, sophisticated, and severe. And that is very true. As I mentioned at the outset, initially with ransomware, you often paid the ransom fee and your information was returned to you, and that is not necessarily the case anymore. We have seen instances where individual company paid the fee and their data was returned, but it was completely destroyed, and it was not in any sort of means that it could be fixed, for lack of sort of a better term, or really used again. And in that case, there were 20 years worth of data that company lost pretty much overnight. So it is really important, I think, when you're looking at this, to look at what data you have, what data you need to retain, how are you retaining that data? Is it being retained sort of in a secure means, such as by encryption? And how long do you need to retain it? We find often that companies will keep data for years and years with really no need to have the data that's 20 years old. There might be some retention period that you need. That could be normal for your particular business or an industry. But usually when you're looking at something like 20 years out, most companies don't need that old data anymore. So one of the other points on this slide here is a significant number of small businesses don't have visibility into their employees' password practices. That's obviously extraordinarily important. Over time, you have sort of seen an evolution of how you, what the best practice is with respect to passwords. There are any number of apps now that can keep your passwords secure. A couple of those apps, I believe, have had data breaches. Having a practice is certainly better than not having a practice. Two-factor authentication, which is generally going to be a little bit of a pain, I think, to employees, because they've got to go through one step and then a second step. However, that does actually, is sort of a certainly more secure method. Having passwords that are unique and not used across various platforms. I think you've probably all heard that one in particular many times, but how many of us actually employ that practice? Because it's much more difficult to remember all the passwords that we have over various platforms and sites, particularly given as internet savvy as the world is today. And after the pandemic, most of us weren't able to go, or during the pandemic, most of us weren't able to go necessarily brick and mortar, so everyone started ordering online more. So the piece of that is ensuring that you actually enforce your password policies. And there are things that you can do there in terms of making sure it's enforced. For example, you can require a change every 3 months once someone sets a password. That's sort of an easy way to do it. So This slide gives you, again, this is from a specific small, medium-sized business study from 2017. So the data is a couple of years old here, but gives you an idea of where, the number of businesses that have experienced cyber attacks during a period of time. And based on the most recent Ponymon report from 2020, these numbers have really just increased. And that report's more sort of not specific to small business, includes a lot of large businesses in there, but the numbers, I can assure you, have gone up significantly. So wanted to spend kind of a significant amount of time today, and this is where you may have questions. And again, you should feel free to ask me at any point in time, if you do, on the various things that you may be able to do within your individual businesses in terms of preventing attacks and mitigating any risk. The most important thing on this list, I'm going to say, is the one at the top. And it's one that you will hear if you've been in any presentation that I've heard or done in the past, or may do in the future. It is training your employees in security principles. You cannot get out in front of your employees generally enough. And it's runs from sort of basic practices and policies, such as requiring strong passwords that as we sort of just mentioned, to training your employees what to look for in phishing type of emails. You've all seen the emails that come across indicating that, the writer is the niece of a very wealthy individual in another country, and she's in dire need of your assistance to get some funds that are being held, and she can't do it without you. Those types of emails tend to be a little bit more obvious, but as sort of time and practices have evolved, particularly by the perpetrators, they're much more, I think, sophisticated and savvy. For example, it could be, thanks for your purchase, here's a receipt, please click on this PDF to open it. That PDF file could contain information that would allow someone to come into your system, which sort of starts the process. So it's training your employees on what to look for. If they find something that's suspicious, not hesitating to sort of raise their hand and say, hey, I'm not sure what this is, can someone take a look at it? Or I didn't know we had to pay this vendor, it's not due yet, why are you asking me to pay it early? And I think employees sometimes may be hesitant to do that, particularly because most employees are really there to do their jobs. They're there to sort of keep the process going on a day-to-day basis. Most employees don't go to work on a regular basis and say, hey, I'm going to tank my employer today, by clicking on a phishing email and launching a ransomware attack into the system. That is not the way it typically works. It is employees who sort of inadvertently and are in the process of doing their job and sort of hastily look through something and don't recognize if they took a couple of extra minutes. So training your employees is critical and absolute here when it comes to sort of protection for small businesses. Protecting information, computers, and networks from attacks. There are companies used to be very diligent, and then they still are. This is not currently a part of my regular job, and sort of pushing out patches and the like for their software. Microsoft, for example, I believe it used to be called Patch Tuesday. I still don't know if they do it on Tuesday, but what that did was patch holes. Where you see a lot of attacks are going to be companies who don't follow a policy of making sure that the software that they are used is updated on a regular basis and those patches are installed. I understand that those patches can be disruptive to sort of daily operations in terms of what happens between 9 and 5 or 9 and 8, whatever your hours are, but those could be done at times, which those patches and updates could certainly be done at times sort of outside of that. Again, it just requires employees to do those things outside of perhaps what their normal working hours are. But it does help protect. One of the largest data breaches recently where companies did not patch was the data breach that essentially shut down Australian Airlines and all of Maersk lines several years ago, and some systems went offline for weeks on end as a result of that, and much of that was because there was a patch that had not been installed. Companies were using an older version of a software and not kept it up to date. So making sure you're patching your software, scanning your computers and keeping them clean, having security software installed and that you're using to search for those risks and the like. So the third thing here, providing a firewall for your internet connection. A firewall is essentially a program that prevents outsiders from accessing data on a private network. It's a security feature, I think, that is pretty fairly easy to enable. It's a matter of making sure that you have your firewalls enabled correctly. And there could be instances where you need to cordon off a particular section within your business. So for example, a lot of times companies will have an additional firewall maybe around their accounting department, and making sure that those sort of within the accounting are sort of further secured from other areas. This has come into play, particularly in the last year, quite a bit, since many employees are working from home. So if you have employees working from home, you really almost need to ensure that their home systems are protected by some sort of firewall as well, because that's sort of one more avenue, so to speak, for someone to make an entry into your system. Creating a mobile device plan. This one I know can give employers and businesses a significant amount of headache. So mobile devices can create significant security and management challenge, especially if they hold any confidential information or can access any part of a network. Making sure users require passwords to protect their devices and encrypting any data. I've seen companies require the installation of particular security apps to prevent criminals from stealing information while the phone is available over public networks. Making sure that you have a procedure to report lost or stolen mobile devices, whether it be a phone or even a laptop that an employee may be using. There's a significant amount of information that obviously can, if you have employees or you have a laptop with all of your business information on it, and if that laptop is not encrypted or that data on that laptop is not encrypted, then you have a significant amount of information at risk. Here I've heard a number of times, well, it requires a password to get into my laptop. Well, unfortunately, that's not sufficient if you're looking for a safe harbor for certain types of violations. A password isn't necessarily going to get you to that safe harbor. You would really need to have all the data on that device encrypted. Mobile devices, cell phones and the like, maybe will not have all of the data encrypted, but there are ways, I think, to encrypt certain types that may be accessible through that mobile device. One of the things that employers I think often struggle with is, particularly if employees use their own devices and you don't have company issued devices, is employees need to understand that employers can access that mobile device, particularly if you're working from it, you're using it for work purposes. And what that means is all the information that may be on it, could be subject to review by an employer. And obviously there are some policies and the like that can be put into place with respect to that, and making sure employees understand that policy and practice. Fifth on this list, make backup copies of important business data and information. I can't tell you the number of times when we have seen data breaches where the company will say to me, well, we don't have a backup of that data, or the last backup we did was 2 months ago. That means you will then have if you're able to sort of retrieve and rebuild that data, you may have a significant gap in the amount of time where you have data. So if it's 2 months, that's a pretty big gap. If you were to say we have a regular backup, we didn't back it up yesterday, but we have the day before that, that's obviously a much smaller gap that you'd have to make up with respect to that. But the backup of data, when you think about what your critical data could include, your financial information, your HR files and records, and HR would include sort of payment records with respect to your employees, accounts receivable and accounts payable data. In addition to that, and probably most obviously, if you are retaining any customer specific data within your systems, that would obviously fall within this category of data and information that you would want to make sure that you have backed up. 6, control physical access to computers. It surprises me at the number of businesses that still will have one account and allow multiple employees to access that one account. It is pretty key to have user accounts for each employee. Now, I do understand from a business standpoint that often can create an increased cost, because if you're licensing a particular software, so to speak, it might be licensed on a per user basis. But having unique accounts for each individual is extraordinarily important. You can often work with the provider if you do have to have user accounts for each individual, and your license is for that software is on a user basis, to make sure that you're not paying for more users than you have, although there are obviously some limitations with respect to that and how often you may have to count employees to determine the number of licenses that you may have. But an area that we see this has been a real problem is particularly when it comes to payment of vendor receipts or vendor invoices and the like, because then you've got two individuals accessing one account. There's a risk that one of the individuals may have, for example, lost his or her password and have been discovered by a third person. If that third person then has it, then you've got another individual who's technically not authorized, but also can access the account. And we've seen that actually happen in a couple of cases. And in one in particular, the financial institution that the company was dealing with not only called the company out for having multiple users access sort of that one account, but also the institution then not being responsible for the funds that were paid from that account to third party that was obviously not authorized to receive the funds. So making sure you have separate accounts and, again, strong passwords is key there. There are certain types of accounts I think it's worth mentioning here that only certain people may have administrative type accounts or administrative privileges for certain accounts. That certainly holds true when you're talking about if your business has any particular IT personnel that you employ or use, that the information that that IT personnel should be able to access is generally going to be at a higher level than other employees. However, then what you have to remember there is what happens on the backside. If you have an IT person to help you, what happens when that individual is terminated or leaves their position? That access needs to obviously be cut off quickly. Now, in many cases, many of you here are going to be wearing multiple hats, and you are responsible for ensuring that the payroll company gets information with respect to wages, and you're also responsible for making sure that vendor invoices are paid, and you're also going to wear the IT hat as well. Again, when that happens, you just have to be mindful of what you're doing at a particular time, and it's obviously recognizing that as a small business, you're going to wear sometimes all of the hats, if not the vast majority of them. So making sure that you're cognizant of what you're doing when you move from task to task can also be really important there. And some of it can be as simple as ensuring that you log out of an account before you start another task in particular, and not sort of leave one open. So seventh, securing your Wi-Fi networks. If you have a Wi-Fi network for your workplace, make sure it's secure and encrypted. You can hide your network or set up wireless access point so it doesn't necessarily broadcast the network name. You can password protect the router for that. Now, I know there are many small businesses in particular that say Wi-Fi is offered here. And if that's sort of a choice that you're going to make, you just have to ensure or really understand what potential risks are with respect to that. We have seen instances where companies have had an open Wi-Fi network that was hacked in by their neighbor, and their neighbor came in, neighbor meaning the company in the sort of retail space right next to them, hacked into their system and took all of their PCI data from their credit card machines. So if you're going to have an open network, I think you probably just have to be aware of what the risks are and making sure, to the extent you can, to put security measures into place in other aspects there. Use best practices on payment cards. Obviously, probably near and dear to everyone's heart here who's on this presentation today. Most of you obviously are going to take payment cards. Making sure here you work with your banks and processors to ensure that they are using sort of the most up-to-date, trusted, validated anti-fraud services in particular. Payment card processors are obviously required to comply with the PCI standards, but PCI to a certain extent is a flow down. So you have to make sure that you're doing that. You're sort of complying with that as well. Having additional security obligations pursuant to agreements with your bank or processor in place, isolating your payment systems from other less secure programs. And we've even seen, some companies only use one particular computer to process payments, and isolating that from any other type of activity that may take place. As a matter of fact, even on an individual level, I know some people that will have a separate computer that they use only for accessing their banking accounts and making online sort of bill pay, in an effort to sort of isolate that from other potential threats or liability. Limiting employee access and to data and information. Not all of your employees need access to all of the data that you may hold, which is important to recognize. For example, if you've got someone in accounting, they obviously need access to certain information. But if you've got someone who it is, let's say, for example, a server, the server doesn't need the same level of access as the individual who processes payroll and payments with respect to vendors and the like. So making sure that you have segmented your employees and the access that they have accordingly is very important. Again, and we've touched on this already, but employing a password and authentication policy and ensuring that employees use unique passwords and change them every so often is extraordinarily important. So again, you know, on all the things here, I would again re-emphasize training. Make sure your employees are aware of the various types of, you know, risks and training them to be sort of proactive and to not be hesitant to say, hey, look, this looks suspicious. Let's look at it before we actually click or do anything with respect to it. I did want to touch briefly on vendor management because your vendors in particular may hold a significant amount of your data. So it's important to understand what your vendors may hold, what data they may have the ability to access, what are they doing with that data, and what's the sensitivity level of that data. Once you sort of have gone through these couple of questions and thought about the what your vendor does and what data they hold and process, it can help you make sure that your contracts have appropriate protections in place. A lot of times what you're going to find is your vendor does not want to be responsible for any type of misuse of the data, and they will limit their liability with respect to that. But I do think it's important to hold your vendors accountable, and really the first place that you need to do that is in your contracts with your vendors. All too often we see sort of incidents where there's clearly an issue at the vendor level that has affected a client. But if you look at the contract, the contract might say the aggregate total liability for the vendor to a client in the event of a breach of this agreement is going to be you know, maybe $5,000. That is not nearly going to cover the cost of a data breach if you have experienced a breach. So looking at those contracts and making sure that you have appropriate protections in place is really important. If there are those of you that outsource your IT, which I understand is very common, particularly for small businesses, because as I mentioned earlier, you're wearing lots of different hats. And there's some hats that may just feel like they're a little too overwhelming to wear, and IT can often be one of those. Making sure that you've got everything in place. So some companies will outsource their IT. There are lots of companies around Hampton Roads that do that type of work. But even with those companies, you really have to make sure that you're holding your IT vendor accountable for what they're doing as well. I mentioned at the outset we would very briefly talk about cyber insurance. So cyber coverage is typically excluded from the other types of insurance that you may have. Now, cyber coverage has evolved quite a lot over the last couple of years. So you may see some companies will have some level of coverage in one of the or more of the categories that I've listed here as where it's typically excluded. And that is sort of certainly what we have experienced is that if you have a general liability policy, it's not going to have cyber coverage in there. Or if you have an E&O policy, it's not necessarily going to have cyber coverage in there. So oftentimes there is, and most oftentimes there's a separate policy that deals specifically with cyber coverage. It typically will cover what we call first party losses as well as third party losses. So first party losses are the direct losses that you experience. The third party losses are damages essentially, to third parties. That's at a very basic level, that's the difference between a first party and a third party loss with respect to that. In terms of sort of the first party coverage, what you generally want to make sure that will be included are some forensic investigation with respect to a breach. There'll be quite a few provisions in a policy that talk about the actual types of breaches and the coverages, whether it's sort of human error or damage to computer hardware and software. It will let you know whether or not the policy will cover, for example, if your server is damaged beyond repair, if it will cover that. And most policies do not actually cover that sort of hardware loss. You can get it, but it might just be sort of an addition to some of the basic coverage. What's really important in terms of coverages is knowing what you're not getting is often really key to understanding the insurance piece of it and what it will not cover. Most policies now will cover ransomware or some type of event of that nature. They may not cover instances of wire fraud, so to speak, where you instructed a third party to pay an amount to a particular account. And again, your bank is usually not going to cover that type of loss either. So as someone mentioned earlier, sort of what should be allocated to cybersecurity. Again, this plays right into that question because it's determining what the right amount of coverage is. Coverage is typically going to be based on, or the cost of the coverage is typically going to be based on your revenues. So large companies are obviously going to generally pay significantly more. The coverage is often for really large companies, the coverage is going to be quite different than it is for small business. If nothing else, having some coverage is often better than having no coverage at all. I often equate cyber insurance to life insurance, and no one really likes to pay for life insurance, particularly when you're the person buying the life insurance, as you don't necessarily get any benefit of the insurance. It's intended for someone else further down the line. But you don't, recognize, I think at the time you're buying life insurance or paying for it all along the way, what the benefit is going to be further down the road. I think cyber insurance is like that. It might seem to be one more cost to your bottom line, but it does typically pay off in many cases if you have it. Okay, so we have a couple of about 10 more minutes or so, and I did want to run through the Virginia Consumer Data Protection Act that was just signed in March by the governor, and that will take effect on January 1, 2023. What's happening right now in the interim is that there has been a work group that has been put together that is developing some best practices and recommendations for implementing the Virginia Consumer Data Protection Act. The CDPA, as we most often refer to it, is a mix of the General Data Protection Act from the European Union, as well as the California Consumer Protection Act. And this Virginia Act falls sometimes more in line with GDPR from the European Union, sometimes falls more in line with California, sometimes sort of creates a new line in a couple of places. that is going to be different from both of those acts. I think very generally speaking, the GDPR from the European Union has sort of been sort of the gold standard for data protection acts that may come out of that. There is no, generally there is no federal law in the US dealing with consumer data protection. There are, as you probably all know, industry segments that have that have federal laws dealing with the protection of the data. HIPAA is one that you're all very familiar with. Everyone's been signing the HIPAA form and notice, and they've been since they've been going to the doctor's office for the past 12 or more years. So that has been at a federal level. There are other laws at a federal level as well, such as FERPA, which deals with educational records. There are some federal laws that deal with consumer records when it comes to background checks and the like that employers may go through, but they're very sort of industry segmented. And again, there's sort of no overarching federal legislation, although I understand that there has been some that has been introduced. So the Consumer Data Protection Act has a fairly narrow scope, which to everyone here may be great news to their ears. So the Virginia law will apply to persons that conduct business in Virginia and produce products or services that are targeted to residents in Virginia. And one of the following: during a calendar year, you control or process personal data of 100,000 consumers. And consumers means Virginia residents, or control or process personal data of at least 25,000 consumers and derive 50% of your gross revenue from the sale of personal data. So that is a more limited and narrow scope than we have seen with the Data Protection Act in the European Union, as well as what is currently in effect in California. So a number of you on this webinar may be exempt from the scope of that. However, it is going to be really important that you look at your history of data. If you have and are retaining data, again, that is really old, like 20 years old, do you hit the 100,000 mark? Will be the question, because processing data can mean storing data. So it's a time, I think, for a lot of companies to look at the data that they are retaining and purging the data that they don't need anymore. Because what you don't want to happen is to get fall within the scope here when you otherwise wouldn't necessarily have this law apply to you. There are a number of exemptions from the Virginia Act, and they're both at an entity level and an information level. So if for example, banks and credit unions that are subject to Gramm-Leach-Bliley, they are not, they are exempt from the Consumer Data Protection Act. Covered entities and business associates under HIPAA, nonprofits, educational institution, and for Virginia government entities. Now, what that means for probably everyone here, most of you are not going to fall within any of those exemptions. So it's going to be a matter of looking at whether or not you fall within the scope and whether or not you'd have to comply with the Consumer Data Protection Act in Virginia. From a data level and information level, again, this mirrors to a certain extent what you see in the entity level exemptions, but data that is subject to Gramm-Leach-Bliley, again, that's going to be financial type data. PHI, which is going to fall under HIPAA. An important one, which isn't in sort of the entity level exemption, is human resource data. I think that's a pretty big exemption here. Business to business data is also not included. Virginia law is very clear that it applies to consumers only and not business data. And then you've got some personal data that's going to fall under various other federal laws, consumer reporting, educational records, and the like. So there are some pretty broad exemptions here. And again, those exemptions are both sort of at the entity level and then specific data that is also exempted. Under the Consumer Data Protection Act, Virginia consumers have certain types of rights. They have the right to access their information. They have the right to essentially take their information elsewhere and ask you to to transfer it. They have the right to correct it. They have the right to delete it, and they have the right to opt out from certain types of data collection practices. So I'm not going to go into great detail on those. Those consumer rights are generally very similar in nature to what we've seen in the European Union as well as in California. When we do talk about this, it's important to know that if you fall within the scope, there will be a certain period of time in which you have to respond to one of these types of requests. And it's set by statute, I believe it's 45 days. So there's a period of time that you have to respond. And if you were to deny a request, you generally have to give information to the consumer as to why it's being denied. And there's an appeals process in Virginia as well. So again, first order of business here is really looking to see whether or not the act actually is going to apply to you. The act, like what we've seen in the European Union and California, has this concept of a controller and a processor. And a controller is the person who, it sounds sort of, is controlling the data and what is happening to it. And the processor is generally the entity that is taking direction from the controller in terms of what to do with the data. So controllers have particular responsibilities under the Data Protection Act, not terribly unlike what we have seen elsewhere in terms of collection and processing and making sure that you're transparent with consumers about what you're doing with the data. Again, I'm not going to go through all these in great detail, but at least wanted to mention them here today. Enforcement. So the Attorney General can impose fines for violations of up to $7,500 per violation. And there's no private right of action under this Consumer Data Protection Act, which means an individual can't sue directly under the act for a violation. The violations or the penalties will rather be imposed by the Virginia Attorney General. So again, the most important part here is looking at the scope and determining whether or not this act may or may not apply to your business. I do think because of the way it's drafted, there'll be a number of businesses that are not going to fall under the thresholds, particularly of the 100,000 consumers data within a 1 year period. And I think more and more businesses are becoming concerned about or attuned to individuals' concern about the privacy of data and are not necessarily selling data. So again, it's important to look at the scope and determine whether or not it may or may not apply to you. So with that, I'm happy. I know this is a lot of information in a short period of time, but I'm happy to take any questions that anyone may have. I don't see any additional questions in the chat feature right now. But.
Hey, Nicole, it's Karen. I had one question about emails. So if you accidentally, like you were saying, if you're just working away and you're kind of not paying full attention and you accidentally open what is a phishing email, does that open you to a security breach, or does it take you responding or opening an attachment?
It can depend on how the email is really configured. A lot of times they're in an attachment itself, or there's a link that is going to be included in the email, and that might be the catalyst is clicking on the attachment or clicking on the link. It may not be the email itself.
Okay, thank you.
Is there anything else? Any other questions? Okay. Well, Nicole, we certainly appreciate this. This was a lot of information today, a lot of good information that I've always heard, and I don't know if this is true or not, that the amount of the fine really doesn't fit the crime. Is that still true? I mean, they were saying that really it should be a lot more what someone would get hit with if they do some kind of data security on you.
Oftentimes it's very difficult to catch the perpetrators of these types of acts. So, and you may never catch them. And there are only a couple of instances I can think of in the course of working in this particular area where a perpetrator has actually been caught. We have seen insiders, so it's an employee who is the perpetrator. But if you're dealing with other sort of outside actors, and oftentimes there are large sort of criminal groups that are perpetrating these types of crimes. I mean, if you think of going into an office and there's 20 floors in a building and people are filing in to go to the different businesses within that office, there are criminal organizations that operate in the same manner. And then there's if you think about sort of in an office building, there's an office building full of people trying to hack into your system and steal data. So it is very difficult to, I think, to find sometimes and prosecute those criminal activities. We've worked on a fair number of cases where the FBI has been involved, and they pay very particular attention to details such as IP addresses, and will look very closely into servers and see what other information that they can find. I know they have, obviously, just like in any other area where the FBI is operating, they have long lists of IP addresses and people that they are targeting. It's just hard to find them.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, how often are you seeing this as an issue for small businesses in Hampton Roads? Do you know, like, is this something that you're seeing often? Is it something that's increasing?
We see it quite often. And what has the dynamic change that what we've seen is for small businesses that don't have insurance, we're still seeing that very, very regularly. For small businesses that have some level of cyber insurance, the cyber insurance policy that you have is generally going to require you to use a certain attorney to help you through that process. You can, in some cases, specify the attorney that you want to use, provided that they have some data privacy and security background and involved in that practice. But most often it's what they're referring you out to what's called panel counsel. So they may refer you to a law firm that they've negotiated rates with that's in Minneapolis. So, we still see a lot of it from an uninsured part. I do know that it's happening for companies that have insurance, because oftentimes we get called, and what will happen is we'll go out to panel counsel once the claim is made with the insurance company. So I would say it's on the rise. It's certainly not decreasing.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? I guess not. Well, thank you again, Nicole. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Nicole. Good information. Okay. We will see y'all next month in May. We'll have another one, and it will be on May 25th. Nope, I take that back. May 27th the gentleman changed the date of his. So, and it will be security from Goodwill, and he'll be talking to us about shoplifting and other issues that they deal with. So thank you again, Nicole. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Y'all have a good day.